When it broke away from the Malaysian Federation in 1965, Singapore seemed destined for disaster. It had virtually nothing. Spanning just 281 square miles, it had no natural resources. Over 80% of its population lived in squatting conditions, and it appeared completely at the mercy of its neighbours, Malaysia to the north and Indonesia just 27 miles to the south. Fast forward less than 2 generations, and the country has transformed into a global hub for finance, technology, and politics. Now, with one of the world's strongest currencies and the highest economic freedom rating, Singapore remarkably accommodates 80% of its residents in well-developed public housing, leading globally in infrastructure quality. In global affairs, Singapore has risen as a formidable player, particularly in defense strategies. 3% of the country's GDP is spent on the military each year. But really, its best form of defense comes from leveraging its location, domestic governance, and forming economic partnerships on the international stage, processes that began over 200 years ago. The pressing question now is whether Singapore's remarkable development can serve as a model for the rest of the world, or if it represents a unique one-time success story, unlikely to be replicated elsewhere, or even by Singapore itself in the coming century. In the dance of geopolitics, Singapore demonstrates that even the smallest can lead if they step wisely. Singapore was incorporated into British colonialism in 1819 to challenge the Dutch, who already had a significant presence in the area. The island was strategically situated on the trade route between British India and China, the so-called Maritime Silk Road. The Dutch East Indies, which controlled Indonesia, were heavily taxing British ships for using their port facilities. Napoleon was defeated back in Europe, freeing Dutch resources to re-establish their presence in Southeast Asia. While the British had gained control of Penang more than 30 years earlier, Singapore was to become the jewel in their Asian crown. For 8,000 Spanish dollars, the British bought rights to the land now known as Singapore. With the signature of an exiled member of the Johor Riau royal family, the British justified their creation of a new trading post. The treaty, issued in both Malay and English, granted the British East India Company the rights to establish a trading post. From its inception, Singapore was an economic project. The port was the only real advantage of the territory. It had been used for centuries as a meeting point for traders. But under British control, trade would dramatically intensify on a scale never before seen in the region. The British quickly began reclaiming land along the Singapore River and distributing it to important international traders, hoping to make the location more attractive for international shipping. There was another major draw. In a sea of expensive Dutch ports, the British were now offering a novel concept, a free port. With the advantage of avoiding large fees and tight restrictions, traders flocked to Singapore. In 1840, Union Bank of Calcutta was the first to set up a branch there, quickly followed by major banks from other countries, including India, Australia, China, and Hong Kong. The economic benefits were obvious. Between 1871 and 1925, maritime trade grew from 65 million to 1.8 billion Singapore dollars. But maritime trade was only one aspect of Singapore's strategy. With the opening of the Suez Canal, the advent of higher-powered steamships and ocean cables, there was a growing demand for fuel. A coal station was established in Singapore. Rapid industrialization in Europe led to increased demands for materials like rubber, tin, and coffee too. All of these came from developing parts of the world, including Southeast Asia. By 1897, about 55 million worth of imports for Britain were coming from the Malay Peninsula, equivalent to 2 billion today. However, the development of Singapore as an international commercial location was changing the governance of the city-state. Despite setting up branches, most trading companies and foreign banks were reluctant to invest in Singapore's domestic market. Instead, they facilitated the distribution of working capital for overseas ventures. With the internationalization of the market, Asian traders, especially Chinese merchants, acted as middlemen between the Asian and European markets, often working in Singapore. Investment in Singapore would need to come from a strong central government, and Singapore's strength was as an international market. Both these lessons would lay the groundwork for modern Singapore. When Singapore gained self-government in 1959, its leaders had this in mind. The People's Action Party, which has overseen the long-term vision of Singapore to this day, was founded by a group of Western-educated Singaporean elites committed to creating a non-communist social democratic state. In the years leading up to independence, trade unions and left-wing politicians had been arrested during what was called Operation Cold Storage, a collaboration between British, Malaysian, and Singaporean governments. After a failed federation with Malaysia, in 1965, Singapore officially became the first country to gain independence against its will. Its leaders quickly shifted to an export-oriented economic model, and industrialization accelerated. Without natural resources, they knew Singapore needed to attract foreign capital. Providing incentives like complementary assets, cheap land, subsidies, infrastructure development, and tight control of labor was the best way. To keep wages low, Singapore imported a huge amount of foreign laborers, powering an industry of low-cost, labor-intensive manufacturing. And it worked. With full control of the domestic economy through foreign and domestic labor, Singapore quickly became the favored country of multinational corporations, driving rapid industrialization. In exchange, these companies shared their technology, vital for Singapore's next stage. Starting from the 1970s, industrialization was accompanied by a shift from low-cost manufacturing to financial services and capital-intensive technological industries. Key to this was the creation of several government-linked companies that took over many enterprises from British hands. State agencies like the Development Bank of Singapore and International Enterprise Singapore have managed policies of economic management and international public relations. In line with Singapore's focus on efficiency and pragmatism, its companies are run as competitively as possible. In fact, some studies show that Singapore's government-linked companies achieve higher valuations than the country's top privately owned companies. Take, for example, Singapore Airlines, which consistently outperforms its competitors and was ranked the world's best airline for the 5th time this year. The company is majority owned by Temasek Holdings, the investment company owned by the government of Singapore, essentially the country's sovereign wealth fund. Temasek Holdings has a AAA global credit rating, and its net portfolio totals $287 billion. Efficiency, competitiveness, and transparency are the primary values of Singaporean business culture. It also has one of the lowest political corruption scores of any country in the world. This is due to the integration of business and political interests. Enshrined in the Constitution is the fusion of public and private spheres. The Prime Minister earns a salary of $2.2 million, while prerequisites for becoming the President of Singapore are to have either 3 years of public sector experience or to have served as CEO of a company for the same amount of time and made a profit for shareholders. Political stability, low corruption, and high innovation have made Singapore one of the most attractive places for business. Finance and trade are central to the continued prosperity of Singapore. Over the last decade, trade has more than tripled the country's GDP on average. Bridging the gap between European and Asian markets has been the way to secure global trade flows. Between the time San Francisco's market closed and the Swiss market opened, Singapore's market facilitated 24-hour trading throughout the world for the first time. Beyond financial interests, though, Singapore maintains power through carefully crafted diplomacy. Singapore was born into a hostile neighborhood. Even before independence, Singapore's leaders were ever conscious of the country's vulnerability to its neighbors. While still in the Malaysian parliament, the first Prime Minister of Singapore used themes of neo-colonialism to build a global non-Western alliance. But once Singapore was cut loose from Malaysia, it quickly opened itself up to trading with any nation, without exception. That included its regional threats: Indonesia, China, and Russia. Subtle political maneuvering was necessary almost immediately after independence. British army bases remaining in Singapore frustrated Indonesia, which fiercely opposed them. Singapore failed to admit the clear economic incentive. The British were paying $50 million, equal to $1.2 billion today, and providing 40,000 jobs. Managing both these relationships meant a constant balancing act between anti-Western rhetoric and pro-Western actions. Secretly, Singapore was encouraged by British troops, but on the surface, leaders used anti-colonial messaging to gain support from developing nations, claiming that the British were there by invitation only. This statecraft hasn't slowed down. Today, Singapore's diplomacy has made its passport the strongest in the world, meaning that Singaporean citizens can travel to 192 destinations without needing a visa. In 2018, Singapore was even chosen as the historic meeting place between then US President Donald Trump and North Korean leader Kim Jong-un. Singapore has used its image as a neutral territory to facilitate trade agreements and to quell regional tensions. After radical political change, Indonesia became more suspicious of Singapore, which they began to view as a majority Chinese city-state. In 1998, Indonesian President B.J. Habibie once dismissed Singapore as a little red dot, while Malaysia has threatened to cut off supplies to the country. Because of its location, though, Singapore has no option but to trade with Malaysia and Indonesia, which are two of its biggest trade partners, only behind China. The headquarters of the Asia-Pacific Economic Cooperation, or APEC, are located in Singapore. It has served as a useful forum for dialogue and to maintain cooperation between at times hostile neighbours. But Singapore has had to build a presence on the global stage too, using diplomacy work stretching far beyond the Asia-Pacific. Since the September 11, 2001 attacks, Singapore has increasingly strengthened ties with North America and European powers. The country has cooperated with a global program of anti-terrorism, but claimed these actions were pro-Singapore rather than pro-US. At the same time, Singapore bolstered its diplomatic presence in the Middle East and North Africa. Whereas the second half of the 20th century was characterized by the relocation of global power towards the partnership between the United States and the Gulf states, the trend of the 21st century has been a shift towards policy with Asia, largely driven by China. In 2000, Oman sent 35% of its crude oil to China. But almost 20 years later, this number jumped to 81%. This trade relationship goes both ways, with the majority of foreign workers in the Gulf countries coming from Southeast Asia. These trends are also evident in Singapore. In 2021, the Qatar Investment Authority opened an office in Singapore, the first Gulf country to do so. This was a landmark moment in Gulf Singaporean diplomacy. Closer to home, Singapore's strategy to maintain a show of strength has been vital to its foreign policy. Undoubtedly, Singapore's biggest concern in the Asia-Pacific region is China, which is rapidly growing into a superpower. China's Belt and Road Initiative, an enormous global-scale infrastructure project, involves investments in 150 different countries, largely through an overland system. But its maritime route will connect China to Vietnam, Kuala Lumpur, Singapore and Jakarta, all the way through Sri Lanka, Kenya and up to the Mediterranean. However, as with its other international counterparts, Singapore has stressed its special relationship with China, using its financial and trade power to act more as a partner rather than a subject of Chinese expansion. A constantly present vulnerability to both internal and external threats has molded Singapore into a decisive government with a long-term economic vision that has turned it into a world player. These policies, along with an absence of subversive political culture and limited civil liberties, have led Singapore to be characterized as an enlightened authoritarianism. Singapore has used its vulnerabilities, such as its size and lack of natural resources, to implement sweeping unified policies that are pragmatic rather than ideological. Singapore is a country that is always looking ahead. It has so far been able to maintain its wealth and position in the region through careful diplomacy and strong government policies. But its necessary reliance on global trade has led to a slowdown in economic growth, Its rebound will depend on how its technological sector develops, powered by the rollout of 5G, industrial automation, and biomedical manufacturing investment. Singapore's position as a global financial hub is not directly threatened yet. However, with two of its major trade partners, the United States and China, still engaged in a trade war initiated by former President Donald Trump, Singapore could be caught in the middle, and it will require more savvy diplomacy to keep all parties content. The unlikely success story of the tiny city-state has served as an inspiration to some of the smallest and poorest countries around the world, seeking to have their own economic miracle, showing that in the garden of time, even the smallest seed can grow into the mightiest tree.
This has been another episode of Meridian Mindset. If you enjoyed it, don't forget to subscribe, hit the like button, and leave a comment down below. We also just launched a new Twitter account, so please give us a follow at Meridian Mindset and check out our other socials as well.
Almost 140 years ago, in 1884, the Berlin Conference kicked off the scramble for Africa, ushering in an era of Western colonialism. The United Kingdom, Germany, France, Portugal and Belgium, along with others, divided up the continent for their interests. The 21st century has seen renewed interest in Africa. The region as a whole is projected to outperform the rest of the world. The continent is projected to be home to as much as 25% of the global workforce by the end of this decade, and the regional GDP is already $2.6 trillion. Out of the 5 fastest growing economies, 3 are in Africa. However, it's no longer Europe leading the way. There has been the rise of 2 new players, China and India. In many ways, still part of the developing world, these 2 powers are seeking to harness Africa's resources to fuel their rapidly expanding economies. Both China and India are funding huge infrastructure projects and providing financing in an attempt to win over the continent. Africa is a key part of China's plans. African leaders arrived in Beijing recently for the Third Belt and Road Forum to take part in what is one of the most ambitious infrastructure projects in human history. European and American leaders are issuing cautionary advice to African nations regarding their international cooperations. These Western powers express concerns about the potential long-term drawbacks of accepting debt, heavy financial packages, warning that such arrangements could ensnare vulnerable states in a cycle of dependency. Despite these warnings, it may already be too late to alter the course of the burgeoning competition for influence in Africa. A key question looms: will China or India emerge as a dominant force on the continent? The outcome of this geopolitical contest could significantly shape the trajectory of the global economy in the coming century. For China, often symbolized as the dragon, and India, represented by the tiger, the strategic importance of Africa, metaphorically referred to as the lion, is undeniable in their quests for continued economic development and expansion. The importance of Africa has been recognized for thousands of years. For European powers, interest intensified during the 15th century, when the slave trade was becoming an integral part of the flourishing economy on the European mainland, and later in the New World of North America. The end of sanctioned slavery passed Africa from one dark chapter to another, as European imperialism moved onto the continent more forcefully to control raw materials like tea, palm oil, ivory, cocoa, as well as diamonds. Africa was also a valuable strategic location between Europe and faraway colonies of India and Asia. Since the mid-20th century, many African groups pushed for liberation. Empowered by a disjointed Europe in the wake of World War II, from the 1940s through to the 1970s, over 45 succeeded. However, what they found was that they were still far from being on equal footing in the realm of global politics. Though they were a step closer to political sovereignty, economic ties continued the familiar dynamics of colonialism. African states slid into trade partnerships with their former European rulers, France emerged as one of the most influential colonial powers in Africa, boasting over 20 territories in the western and northern parts of the continent. Their dominance spanned more than 3 centuries, during which they controlled about 35% of Africa. Even after these territories gained independence, France's influence persisted through a maintained military presence and continued extraction of key resources like oil, iron, and increasingly, uranium. It was only in 2020 that the West African Economic and Monetary Union took a significant step towards economic independence by phasing out the CFA franc, a currency legacy of French colonial rule, and introducing the eco in its place. The African Union, comprising all 55 African states, is steadfast in its resolve to enhance the continent's autonomy. Despite these strides, challenges to the region's economic prosperity remain, with infrastructure being a primary concern. The region significantly trails the developed world in road network development, which hampers trade and transportation. Financial access is another major hurdle. The region's low foreign exchange liquidity has led to apprehension among international banks about extending credit, posing a significant obstacle to economic growth. That is, except for China. Between 2000 and 2019, China committed $153 billion to projects in Africa or local governments, most of them infrastructure-related. China has been intimately involved in economic support in the region for more than half a century. Now China is starting to see returns. Chapter 2: The Rise of the Dragon. Out of the old order was born a new group of developing countries, keen to catch up to Europe and the United States. The 1955 Bandung Conference, held in Indonesia, political and economic alliances to resist colonial powers were created. The then dominating global economic model, the gold-backed Bretton Woods system, was perceived as excluding the developing world. Among them was a group of African countries, Egypt, Liberia, and Libya, as well as Middle Eastern and Asian powers, including China, which was a huge supporter of the conference. Modern Chinese-African relations stem from this historic meeting. It was an important moment for so-called non-aligned countries to organize collectively. These were non-Western states that had historically been either controlled or dominated by colonialism and the emerging global capitalist economy. From this recognition, the basis for future partnerships, many of which continue today, was born. Since then, China's involvement in Africa has only deepened. While Western powers were fighting to suppress African liberation, China was supporting anti-apartheid and liberation movements. In 1974, China funded the Tazara Railway, sending tens of thousands of workers to help finish the project. It covers 1,865 kilometers, linking landlocked Zambia to Tanzania, before traveling all the way to the port of Dar es Salaam in the east of Africa. It helped to combat Zambia's dependence on neighboring states of South Africa and Rhodesia, which threatened to leverage access to the sea. The cost of the railway was $406 million and was provided as an interest-free loan. This is equivalent to over $3 billion today and still stands as one of the most expensive foreign aid projects in history. By the end of the century, China's economy was rapidly expanding, averaging around 9% GDP growth every year. There was an even greater attention to African development. In the first decade of the 21st century, the Chinese economy has grown a staggering 9.5% per year on average. This marked a changing point for sustainability. Increases in oil and natural gas production were not quick enough to keep up with demand, forcing China to look for imports. The state encouraged Chinese companies to seek joint ventures and investments overseas instead. This strategy worked. In the process, it changed the global energy market. By 2014, China had overtaken the United States to become the single biggest oil importer in the world. The United States is now projected to be a net exporter of crude oil for the first time since World War II. This has been driven by major discoveries of shale resources in the country. China has taken advantage, moving in to replace the United States in Africa and Latin America. In the wake of the 2007-2008 global financial crisis, China was able to buy up oil and gas assets at bargain prices. This aggressive investment only began to slow down in 2014. China's push for infrastructure and foreign direct investment in Africa is part of this long-term oil strategy. Between 2005 and 2017, China's foreign direct investment in Africa's energy sector was estimated to be $86 billion. More than a third of that went into either gas or oil projects. Oil has been exchanged for favorable loans and credit lines. However, participation in certain countries comes at great risk, both economically and in the international community. China's operations in Africa are not always simple. Emerging from independence, many African countries have been rife with political tensions, conflict, and instability. China has needed to strategically back ruling groups with the power to provide access to natural resources. Those powers are often unfavorable to the local population. For example, in Sudan, where China has been importing oil for more than 3 decades, Beijing supported the ruling elite in the face of an uprising. This eventually resulted in a split that created South Sudan, which descended into a civil war. China's interests remained unchanged despite recorded human rights abuses. Control of oil fields has been maintained for now, though continuing violence and unrest characterize Sudan on the brink of another civil war. Elsewhere, more immediate effects of China's investments are felt. A proposed oil pipeline running from Uganda to Tanzania threatens to impact the lives of millions. This has drawn widespread disapproval and pushback against Chinese interference. In a sign of growing tensions between local movements and international investment, oil infrastructure in Nigeria is being targeted by militant groups. However, Beijing has shown no indication of backing out of Africa, which has been called a bedrock of their foreign policy. There is more than oil at stake. For China, gambling on unstable investments is worth the risk if it means winning over Africa. Chapter 3. The Dragon's Belt and Road. China is undertaking one of the most ambitious infrastructure projects in human history. President Xi Jinping, unveiling the plans back in 2013, likened it to a new Silk Road, the ancient Eurasian trade route that connected the Western world to the Eastern world. This new project is even bigger. Called the Belt and Road Initiative, it will use land, rail, and maritime infrastructure to connect China to the Middle East and Europe. Already, 155 countries have been included in the project. It is a way to put to use its huge savings and activate its underused industries, which face a deficit of domestic demand, as well as to take a leading role in global trade. Creating trading routes that are not subject to United States foreign policy will give China more control. Much of the developing world has embraced the project. It's generally seen as a win-win for both sides. China gets to expand its trade, while smaller countries are injected with much-needed infrastructure, resources, and loans. For many countries, China's proposals offer to fill gaps that are left by the International Monetary Fund and the global community. Numerous African nations, including Nigeria, Cameroon, the Republic of Congo, Angola, Zambia, Kenya, Uganda, Ethiopia, and Egypt, have secured loans from China. A notable example is the 2017 inauguration of a Chinese-funded railway in Kenya, marking a significant step in linking landlocked regions to the rest of East Africa. Consequently, China accounts for nearly 20% of Kenya's external debt, amounting to approximately $2 billion. Ethiopia and Uganda have also engaged in substantial borrowing from China for infrastructure projects, including railway and hydropower station developments. Concerns have arisen regarding these financial arrangements. The United States, a major competitor of China in global trade, has expressed opposition, citing a lack of transparency in both trade and financial reporting. For instance, Zambia's reported debt to China was found to be almost twice the publicly stated amount. This discrepancy fuels criticism that China may be engaging in what's termed debt trap diplomacy, fostering dependency among borrowing nations. Fears extend to the potential influence of China's political model on these financially reliant countries. Most loan agreements are pegged to LIBOR or Euribor rates, implying that rising global interest rates could escalate the cost of loan servicing. Between 2000 and 2019, China restructured or forgave 140 debts, indicating potential instability in its lending practices. This aggressive strategy in extending financial aid to development-seeking countries is heightening tensions in the ongoing trade rivalry between China and the United States. Unlike during the Cold War, China's interests are more material than opposing capitalism. Energy is a huge motivation. Infrastructure development is vital to ensuring the flow of resources. Beyond raw materials and minerals, there are not many imports from Africa flowing into China. That's not to say that ideology and history don't play a role. China is becoming a leading development partner to many former European colonies. The shared experience has become an important part of Chinese public rhetoric, demarcating themselves from Western powers. However, it's difficult to deny the asymmetrical power. China has ballooned to account for 18% of the global economy. With 1.4 billion people and more than 3 decades of nearly unbroken GDP growth, the IMF now estimates that the Chinese economy is 20% bigger than the US economy. Africa is dealing with a trade partner arguably more powerful than their former colonizers. Of course, there are a myriad of advantages to this trade. Like the rest of the global economy, COVID-19 significantly slowed most economic activity in Africa. China stepped in to donate 1 billion doses of the much-needed vaccine to African countries, with almost half of those produced on the continent, helping to foster a regional pharmaceutical industry. In Niger, China's CNPC helped convert the country into an oil producer, building the first refinery that it has majority ownership of. In Zimbabwe, China even built a new parliament for the country. Two-way trade between Africa and China totaled $254 billion in 2021, up more than a third from the previous year. This support may finally be drying up, though. In 2016, loans to the sum of $28.5 billion to African countries were approved. Last year, that number was below $1 billion. China is now the biggest debt collector in the world, but the phase of low interest rates doled out to strategic partners looks to have ended. Beijing is tightening its spending. As the primary lender to many developing countries, China's main objective now is to ensure enough liquidity. The risk is that China has overextended itself, leaving Africa open to a new player. Chapter 4. India's New Frontier. Like China, India has used its shared experience with colonialism to encourage positive relations with Africa throughout the Cold War. In the mid-20th century, as both regions began to set themselves free from imperial subjugation, they emerged together as part of the non-alignment movement. While India wrestled with internal conflicts, it fell behind China's involvement in Africa. As India's economy opened up approaching the 21st century, trade with Africa was once again strengthened. Now, India's booming economy has allowed it to pick up interest in Africa again as a part of its quest for resources, business opportunities, and strategic partnerships overseas. Prime Minister Narendra Modi's government devised 10 guiding principles for India to engage with Africa. These prioritize the goals of Africa, enhance local opportunities, open markets, support technological development, and aim to combat climate change. One reason for the renewed focus is migration between the two regions. There are over 3 million people of Indian origin in Africa now, mainly concentrated in South Africa, Uganda, Tanzania, and Kenya. These population movements date back to colonial times, a history that has driven a more organic involvement for India in Africa than China. Behind demographics is the search for resources. India has less than 0.5% of the world's oil reserves. The rapidly growing economy, which is on course to be one of the 3 biggest consumers of energy in the next 7 years, needs to secure a stable and cheap energy supply, and fast. This is driving Indian investment in Africa, which is projected to reach $150 billion by 2030. India has already committed $14 billion in Nigeria alone. The major industries are steel, petroleum and power plants, $3 billion in the steel sector, and $8 billion for increasing production of a petrochemical facility, leaving over $1.5 billion for power plants as well as the defense industry. India's state-owned oil and natural gas corporation is pumping $6 billion into Nigeria. The funds will go primarily to infrastructure, and in exchange, the two companies gain access to oil exploration rights and 2 acreages. These new inflows of foreign investment signify a shift in domestic politics in Nigeria. President Bola Tinubu has promised to reverse a history of debt and unemployment by inviting transnational corporations and governments to invest in companies and infrastructure. Nigeria is a key investment target, not only for its natural resources, but also its demographic. The country is the most populous in Africa and might soon be applying to join the G20, which would make it the second after South Africa on the continent to become a member. As a step in this direction, President Tinubu was invited to the G20 summit in New Delhi by India. Nigeria is not an isolated target for India. Elsewhere, India has bought up offshore blocks and properties in Egypt, Côte d'Ivoire, Libya and Sudan. In some areas, India is directly bidding against China. This competition has done nothing to dissuade India. In 2015, China's economy slowed down to a 25-year low growth rate. India was quick to pounce on opportunities in Africa and outbid Chinese investment. Between 1991 and 2007, Indian trade with Africa multiplied more than 25 times, from 967 million to 25 billion. In 2022, this jumped to $89.5 billion. The African Union is now the 4th largest trading partner for India, behind the United States, China, and the United Arab Emirates. In fact, India actually runs a trade deficit with the African Union. More than 3 times as much is being invested in India from Africa, much of it coming from Mauritius. Many Indian businesses have used the country to avoid taxes, bolstered by a bilateral tax treaty that allowed companies to avoid capital gains taxes when selling Indian assets. In terms of exports, India has traditionally sent textile yarns, but has now transitioned to petroleum products, chemicals, and over time, manufactured products and pharmaceuticals. This codependence has given India a unique relationship with Africa. The value of a partnership is not solely economic either. Africa is increasingly looking to India for help with establishing democratic institutions. As the world's largest democracy, India offers a major benefit over the one-party system of China. If Africa hopes to integrate into the global economy, India will be a valuable partner moving forward, especially as Indian companies expand internationally. Both India and China offer distinct advantages. If African countries want to progress past a stage of raw material production and to advanced economies, there are lessons to be learned from how China transferred technology from the West throughout the 1980s. More importantly, as a key part of the Belt and Road Initiative, Africa stands to benefit immensely in the form of infrastructure and financing. On the other hand, India's explosive economy is driven by innovation and technology. Many African countries already have close trade relations with India, and investment is moving both ways. However, for access to technology, investment and support, both China and India will be expecting natural resources in return. Historically, Africa has experienced a division and subjugation by external forces, adept at exploiting these divisions for their own benefit. This history poses a critical question. Can Africa, drawing lessons from its past, forge a unified stance in dealings not only with nations like India and China, but also with other global powers inclined to exploit its vast resources while offering minimal returns? The complexity of achieving cooperation across the continent's diverse regions, countries, and cultures is undeniable, yet it might be the sole path forward. Echoing the wisdom of an ancient African proverb, "Cross the river in a crowd and the crocodile won't eat you." Unity might be Africa's strongest defense and strategy for progress, the last hope for a continent that has long been seen by the rest of the world as hopeless.
This has been another episode of Meridian Mindset. If you enjoyed it, don't forget to subscribe, hit the like button, and leave a comment down below. We also just launched a new Twitter account, so please give us a follow at Meridian Mindset and check out our other socials as well.